Chapter 1 Echoes in the Embers. The scent of dried vervain clung to Aria's hands, a bitter perfume that never quite washed away. 5 years. 5 years she had measured her life in the rustle of herbs and the low crackle of a healing fire. She gently crushed the leaves in a stone bowl, the rhythmic grinding of familiar prayer for peace. Outside, the world of their crescent moon pack moved on with the seasons, but inside her small cottage, time was a still, quiet pool. She preferred it that way. Stability was a balm for a wound that refused to scar over. Continuing from her work with the herbs, she moved to the hearth. Aria, the pack's eldest elder, watched her with eyes as faded as winter skies. "You have a gift, child. Your hands know how to soothe." Aria offered a small, practiced smile. "The plants do the work. I just listen." "You listen to everything but your own heart," Aria murmured, her voice a soft rasp. "It is not natural for a wolf to be alone. The moon intended for us to have a partner." The old woman's words were kind, yet they prodded at the carefully constructed walls around Aria's soul. "I have the pack," Aria replied, her tone purposefully light. She stoked the fire, its warmth chasing away the chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She had the pack, because that was all she had left. To want more felt like a betrayal. To need more felt like tempting fate to strike again. A sudden image flashed behind her eyes, a laugh that sounded like rumbling thunder, the impossible green of his eyes, the faint scar above his brow. Rowan. The name was a ghost on her tongue, a memory she shoved back into the darkness before it could breathe. He was gone, dead, believing that was the only reason she was still standing. Just as the silence grew heavy, the cottage door burst open. A young pack scout, barely a man, stood panting on the threshold, his chest heaving. Rain and mud splattered his leathers. "Riders," he gasped out, "from the northern ridge." Aria straightened, her ancient spine going rigid. "Rogues." The scout shook his head, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "Worse, it's news. About the king." Aria's hands stilled over the fire. King? They hadn't had a true alpha king in generations, not since the Great Schism. The title felt alien, a relic from a bloodier time. "He calls himself the Cold Alpha," the scout continued, his voice dropping. "He has united the fractured northern clans. They say he commands an army, that he moves like a winter storm, silent and unstoppable. He spoke of a brutal efficiency, of rogue packs either bending the knee or being shattered into dust. This wasn't just a power grab, it was a conquest." Aria felt a strange shiver trace its way down her spine because this felt like something ancient and terrible awakening. What could drive a wolf to such ruthless ambition? The scout pulled a crumpled piece of parchment from his tunic. It was a decree, stamped with a sigil. He held it out. "He demands fealty from all packs. He is rebuilding the old kingdom." Aria took the paper, her fingers trembling slightly as she unrolled it. Aria's gaze was snagged by the seal at the bottom, pressed into black wax. It was a snarling wolf's head, its fangs bared in a silent promise of violence. And above it, crowning the beast, was the distinct shape of a crescent moon, broken in two. Her breath caught. A coincidence. It had to be. Rowan used to carve that exact symbol into the old willow by the creek. Their symbol. A broken moon for two halves of one soul. But this king wasn't her Rowan. Her Rowan was gentle. He was laughter and sunshine, and whispered promises in the dark. This cold, brutal alpha was a monster from a story. And yet, as the fire popped and hissed, the ghost of a dead boy's promise had just walked back into her world. Chapter 2 Whispers on the Wind. Days later, the tension that had arrived with the scout had woven itself into the very fabric of the pack. It was a tangible thing, sharp and metallic in the air at the great bonfire, the pack's weekly gathering. The flames leaped high into the night, casting flickering shadows that danced like uneasy spirits across the faces of her packmates. Aria kept to the edge of the circle, nursing a cup of warm cider, the sweet steam doing little to thaw the knot of ice in her stomach. She watched the others, the forced laughter of the elders, the nervous swagger of the young warriors, the mothers pulling their children a little closer. They were all afraid. From this vantage point, she could hear snippets of conversation carried on the wind. Two grizzled hunters spoke in low tones, their words sharp and grim. "Took down the Crimson Fang Pack in a single night," one of them muttered, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Tore their alpha apart with his bare hands, didn't even shift." "I heard he doesn't have a wolf," the other whispered back, a note of superstitious dread in his voice. "That he's just a man with the strength of 10 beasts. They say his eyes are like frozen pools, not a flicker of warmth in them." Aria's fingers tightened around her mug. The descriptions didn't fit. They couldn't fit. The Rowan she remembered had a wolf so magnificent, so full of life, it had made the very forest seem to hold its breath. This cold Alpha King was a phantom, a boogeyman forged from fear. Still, her own wolf, so long dormant within her, stirred. It paced the confines of her soul, restless and agitated, its hackles raised for a reason she refused to name. Why did these stories feel like a song she almost recognized? It was an unsettling pull, a sense of connection to a brutal stranger she should despise. Following that unsettling feeling, a familiar presence approached from her side. "Aria." Liam's voice was gentle, but it still made her flinch. He was handsome, strong, and had been patiently trying to gain her affection for years. He saw her as a beautiful, broken thing to be fixed. "Don't listen to them. They're just trying to scare each other." "It seems to be working," she said, not looking at him. He moved a little closer, his warmth an unwelcome intrusion into her cold bubble. "Fenris will protect us. This king, he's far away. He won't bother with a small pack like ours." He reached out, his hand hovering over her arm. "You seem distant tonight." Distant? She had been distant for 5 years. Before she could answer, a hush fell over the gathering. Alpha Fenris, his silver-streaked hair gleaming in the firelight, had stepped onto the speaking platform. His face was a mask of grim authority. "Brothers! Sisters!" his voice boomed, silencing the last of the murmurs. "I will not fill your ears with platitudes. The world is changing, power is shifting, and we must shift with it or be broken." He let the weight of his words settle. "I have received a formal summons. The Alpha King is sending a royal envoy to our territory." A collective gasp went through the crowd. An envoy. Here. It was no longer a distant threat. It was a direct command. Fenris continued, his gaze sweeping over his pack. "We will greet them with the respect their station demands. We will show them the strength and loyalty of the Crescent Moon Pack. There will be no defiance, is that understood?" A chorus of reluctant, "Yes," alphas answered him. Aria felt her blood run cold because she knew this was more than politics. It was a test. Then, for a heart-stopping second, Fenris's gaze found hers across the firelit clearing. His old eyes held a flicker of something she couldn't decipher. Pity? Warning? He knew her story better than anyone. He was the one who had told her Rowan was gone forever. The arrival of the king's men felt less like a diplomatic visit and more like a reckoning aimed directly at her still-beating, traitorous heart. Chapter 3. The Scent of Ghosts. The morning the envoy was set to arrive, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. A nervous silence had fallen over the village, a stark contrast to its usual bustling energy. Children were kept indoors, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves in the anxious wind and the distant cry of a hawk. Aria stood among her pack in the central square, her arms crossed tight against her chest, as if she could physically hold herself together. She had told herself she wouldn't come. She had sworn she would stay in her cottage, hidden away. But some morbid, self-destructive curiosity had pulled her here. She had to see. She had to know for sure. As if summoned by her dread, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the forest road. They were slow, deliberate, a rhythmic drumbeat of impending doom. A line of riders emerged from the tree line, their forms dark against the pale morning light. They were massive, each warrior clad in armor of polished obsidian and gleaming silver that seemed to swallow the sun. Their discipline was absolute. They moved as one silent, terrifying unit. The sheer power rolling off them was a suffocating wave, pressing down on the square, making it hard to breathe. Their leader, a scarred wolf with a cruel mouth, dismounted and strode forward, his steel-greaved boots ringing on the cobblestones. And then it hit her. A scent on the wind. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the smell of horse, leather, and the cold metal of their armor. But it was there, pine needles after a storm. And something else. Something she hadn't smelled in 5 agonizing years. Her heart gave a painful lurch, a violent kick against her ribs. No, it was impossible. A trick of the mind. Grief was a cruel master, known for conjuring ghosts from memory and air. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to banish it, because if she let herself believe, the hope would shatter her more completely than the sorrow ever had. Nevertheless, her wolf was not so easily convinced. It surged within her, a desperate, frantic thing, clawing at the cage of her control. "He's here," it howled in her mind. "Mate, he's here." The inner turmoil was so intense she felt dizzy, her vision swimming at the edges. The scarred leader stopped before Alpha Fenris and gave a curt, almost insulting nod. "Alpha Fenris, my king sends his greetings." His voice was gravelly, devoid of any warmth. He gestured back toward his silent ranks. "He has come to accept your pledge of fealty in person." A collective tremor went through the pack. The king himself? Here? The leader stepped aside, creating a path. From the center of the formation, another figure dismounted. He moved with a liquid, predatory grace that made the other warriors look like lumbering statues. He was taller, broader, his presence a vortex of raw, untamed power that dwarfed everyone else's. He wore no helmet, only a simple black hood that shadowed his features. He walked forward, each step a silent thunderclap against Aria's sanity. He stopped in the center of the square, and, with an agonizing slowness, he reached up and pulled back his hood. The world stopped. It was Rowan's face. The strong jawline, the straight nose, the dark, unruly hair. But it was a version of him carved from ice and shadow. The boyish softness was gone, scraped away and replaced with the hard, unforgiving lines of a man who had seen hell and brought a piece of it back with him. The gentle warmth in his eyes had been extinguished, leaving behind 2 chips of glacial green, empty and vast. His gaze swept dismissively over the terrified pack, a king reviewing cattle. And then his eyes found hers. They stopped. They locked. There was a flicker, a barest tremor deep within those frozen depths. It wasn't love. It wasn't joy. It was the cold, hard shock of a man staring at a ghost from a life he had long since buried. And in that silent, soul-shattering moment, Aria knew her own haunting had just been given flesh and blood. Chapter 4. The King of Ash and Ice. The world, which had collapsed into the frozen space between their eyes, rushed back in a torrent of sound and sensation. A collective breath was released from the pack, a soft whoosh of shock and fear. Rowan was the first to look away. The act was a small, sharp severance, a dismissal that cut Aria deeper than any blade. He turned his attention to Alpha Fenris, and the man who had been her entire world became a stranger in the space of a heartbeat. His posture was no longer the relaxed slouch of the boy she'd loved. It was the rigid, unyielding stance of a commander. He was power made manifest. Alpha Fenris. Rowan's voice was the first shock. It was a low baritone, a familiar timbre buried under layers of ice and steel. The warmth, the melodic lilt she remembered. All of it was gone, scoured away. Your pack is on the eastern border of my territory. Your loyalty is not a request. It is a requirement for your survival." While he spoke of strategy and resources, Aria's mind was a maelstrom. 5 years. 5 years she had mourned him, waking from nightmares of the rogue attack that had supposedly stolen his life. She had built a fortress around the hollow space he'd left behind, brick by painstaking brick. And here he stood. Not a miracle. Not a blessing. A ghost wearing the crown of a tyrant. Rage, hot and volcanic, warred with a stupid, treacherous hope that fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. He was alive. But the man in front of her was not the one she had lost. Indeed, this new reality was a cruel parody of her dreams. Rowan laid out his terms with chilling precision, a tithe of warriors, a pledge of absolute fealty, and adherence to his laws. There was no room for debate. He was not asking for an alliance, he was annexing them. Throughout his speech, he never once glanced her way again. Yet she felt the weight of his awareness. It was a pressure against her skin, a cold spot in the air around her. He knew she was there, and he was deliberately ignoring her. The public denial was a calculated cruelty, a way to establish the chasm that now lay between them. Just when she thought the ordeal was over, as Rowan prepared to depart, his second-in-command, the scarred warrior, leaned in and whispered something in his ear. Rowan's head snapped up. His glacial gaze shot across the square and slammed into Aria once more. This time, it was different. It wasn't shock or dismissal. It was cold, hard calculation. A flicker of something ancient and possessive burned in those depths before being extinguished. He was a king deciding the fate of a pawn on his chessboard. She understood this because she had seen that look on Fenris's face when he decided the fate of a pack member who had broken the law. The scarred wolf, whose name she learned was Kael, detached from his king's side and moved toward her. Each step he took was a hammer blow against her heart. He stopped directly in front of her, his shadow falling over her like a cage. His eyes were devoid of any emotion as he spoke, his voice a low growl that cut through the silence of the stunned crowd. "The king will see you," he announced, the words echoing in the unnaturally quiet square. "Now, alone." The public summons wasn't an invitation. It was a brand, separating her from her pack and marking her as something that belonged to him. Chapter 5. A Room of Echoes and Lies. The tent was as cold and impersonal as its owner. There was no warmth here, no comfort. Just a simple cot, a campaign desk covered in maps, and the faint, lingering scent of ozone and power. Aria paced the cramped space, a caged animal, her anger a burning inferno in her gut. Each passing second fueled the fire. How dare he? How dare he summon her like a servant after ripping her world apart not once, but twice? She had questions, 5 years worth of them, and they were boiling inside her, demanding to be screamed. The tent flap swept open, and he was there. The space, already small, seemed to shrink to nothing. Rowan filled it completely, his presence a physical force that stole the air from her lungs. The scent of him, that impossible, heart-wrenching mix of pine, storm, and cold stone, was overwhelming, a direct assault on her senses. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, watching her, his face an unreadable mask of stone. That silence was the final spark. "Why?" The word ripped from her throat, raw and ragged. "Rowan, why?" He flinched at his name, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. "That is not my name anymore," he said, his voice flat. "I am your king." "My king?" she shot back, taking a step toward him, her fists clenched. "You were my mate. You were everything. And you disappeared. They told me you were dead. I mourned you. I grieved for you." Her voice broke on the last word, the pain of it still so fresh. "Where have you been?" "Surviving," he clipped out, his gaze fixed on a point just over her shoulder. He wouldn't look at her, truly look at her. He was using his title, his coldness, as a shield, and it infuriated her because she knew the man hiding behind it. She pushed forward, closing the distance between them until she could feel the chill radiating from his body. That's not an answer. We were attacked. I saw you go down. I felt the bond snap. She choked on the memory, the phantom agony that had nearly killed her. What happened? The past is dead, he stated, his voice dangerously low. Let it stay buried. I can't, she cried, her desperation overriding her fear. She reached out, her hand grabbing his forearm. His flesh was like cool marble, but beneath it, a current of heat pulsed. The moment her skin touched his, a jolt, sharp and electric, shot through them both. His eyes slammed down to meet hers, and for a breathtaking second, the mask shattered. She saw it all. A maelstrom of pain, of fury, of a longing so profound it mirrored her own. The king was gone, and for a flash, her Rowan was looking at her. Don't, he growled, the word a raw vibration that shook his entire frame. His control was fraying, stretched thin. His free hand shot up, his fingers wrapping around her throat, not to harm, but to hold. His thumb stroked the pulse point, feeling the frantic beat of her heart. Aria. Her name was a ghost, a prayer, a curse. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the moment was gone. He shoved her back, stumbling away from her as if she were fire. He turned his back to her, his broad shoulders tense. The king was back in place, his voice once again carved from ice. You are a complication I did not foresee. He took a deep, shuddering breath, regaining his composure. You cannot stay here. It is not safe. Before she could process his words, he turned his head slightly. You will come to the capital. You will be under my protection and my watch. I have decided. He wasn't asking her. He was imprisoning her, claiming her, and she had no idea if he was doing it to protect her or to control the one piece of his past that had refused to stay dead. Chapter 6: The Gilded Cage. The next morning arrived with a cold gray finality. Kyle and 2 of the king's royal guards stood at the door of her cottage. They weren't asking for permission. Their presence was an occupation. 1 bag, Kyle stated, his voice flat and unimpressed by the cozy, herb-scented life she had built. The king is not a patient man. Fury, sharp and helpless, rose in Aria's throat. This was her home. These were her things. This was her life, and he was ripping her from it with the casual arrogance of a god. From there, she tried to fight, but it was like throwing pebbles against a mountain. She argued with Kale, who simply stared through her. She appealed to Alpha Fenris, who met her gaze with a deep, weary sadness. There is no choice, Aria, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. His power is absolute. To defy him is to invite the destruction of this entire pack. You're going with him. It is a sacrifice to keep the rest of us safe. The words were meant to give her purpose, but they only made her feel like a lamb being led to slaughter. Her goodbyes were a blur of fractured moments. Alara pressed a small leather pouch into her hand, the familiar scent of calming herbs a silent blessing. Liam stood nearby, his face a thunderous mask of rage and impotence, unable to challenge a king. Each sympathetic glance from her packmates felt like a nail in her coffin. They were safe because she was being taken. This was the price of their peace. As a result of this swift departure, the journey to the capital was a silent, grueling affair. They rode hard and fast, the royal guards a seamless unit of black and silver around her. The familiar, gentle forests of her home gradually gave way to a harsher, more unforgiving landscape. The trees grew thin and twisted, clinging to the sides of jagged, snow-dusted mountains. The air grew colder, thinner. It was as if the world itself was mirroring her journey from the warmth of her past into the frozen, unknown territory of her future with Rowan. After 2 days of relentless travel, they arrived. The capital wasn't a castle of soaring spires and fairy tale grandeur. It was a fortress, a brutalist masterpiece of black granite carved directly into the heart of the largest mountain, its towers like jagged shards of obsidian scraping at the sky. It was a monument to power, intimidation, and defense. It was a perfect reflection of the man Rowan had become, impenetrable, formidable, and cold to the bone. As Keo led her through the colossal iron gates, the sound of them closing behind her was a deafening boom of finality. They entered a great hall that could have swallowed her entire village whole. The ceiling was lost in shadows, the walls were bare stone hung with banners bearing the broken moon sigil, and the air was frigid. Dozens of powerful, hardened wolves, warriors, council members, alphas of conquered packs, lined the hall. They stopped their conversations as she entered, and 100 pairs of predatory eyes turned to fix on her. They were assessing, judging, their thoughts a palpable wave of suspicion and hostility. She saw no welcoming faces. She saw no kindness. In that moment, as she stood shivering in the center of that vast, cold hall, the last foolish ember of hope died within her. She finally understood. Rowan hadn't brought her here to rekindle a lost love. He had brought her here as a possession, a complication, a prisoner in his gilded, icy cage. Chapter 7. The Court of Whispers. Aria's new chambers were a masterpiece of luxurious imprisonment. Silken tapestries depicting ancient, bloody battles covered the cold stone walls, and a vast bed was piled high with furs so white they seemed to glow in the dim light. But the opulence was a lie. It was a cage no matter how gilded. The one large, arched window offered a breathtaking view of the mountain range and a sheer 1,000-foot drop. There was no balcony. There was no escape. She was a bird with clipped wings put on display in a beautiful prison, and she knew he had designed it this way. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of isolation. The servants who brought her meals were silent and deferential, their eyes always downcast, skittering away from her as if she carried a disease. The nobles and warriors she passed in the fortress corridors would fall silent, their gazes a mixture of open hostility and sharp, assessing curiosity. She was the king's ghost, a relic from a past he had supposedly carved out of himself. Her presence here was a riddle they all wanted to solve, and a weakness they all seemed eager to exploit. She felt less like a person and more like a symbol, a chink in the impenetrable armor of their cold alpha king. Refusing to be broken, Aria began to watch and listen. She learned that Rowan's rule, while absolute, was not mindless tyranny. She saw him preside over his court from a throne of polished black granite, his pronouncements swift and final. He punished a beta who had stolen grain from the winter stores with a week in the dungeons, but he also rewarded a scout who had risked his life to map a safe passage through the treacherous peaks with a new title and lands. He was building a kingdom from the ashes of the old one, forging order with a hand of iron because, she started to realize, he believed it was the only way to hold back the chaos. This was not the gentle boy who dreamed of a peaceful life with her. This was a man reforging the world to fit his will. Driven by a desperate need for a piece of herself back, she began to test the boundaries of her cage. She demanded to be let out into the small, wind-whipped garden within the inner walls. After a silent, tense standoff, Kale eventually permitted it, though 2 guards shadowed her every step. She was a prisoner with privileges. It was in this garden, hiding behind a thick, thorny hedge, that she heard the whispers that would curdle her blood. 2 noblewomen, their voices low and conspiratorial, were discussing the king. A formal alliance with the Sunstone Pack is the only way to secure the southern border before winter, one said, her tone sharp, and Alpha Valerius insists a marriage pact is the only way to guarantee it, the other replied. The Alpha's daughter Lyra is of pure blood, a strong mate for a strong king. Aria's breath hitched. A marriage pact? A betrothal? The conversation continued, each word a shard of ice in her heart. It is what the kingdom needs, the first woman said with an air of finality. He needs a powerful queen to stand beside him, not some forgotten stray from a past he should have left buried. The casual cruelty of the words struck Aria with the force of a physical blow. A cold, sickening dread washed over her. Was this the reason he had brought her here? To lock her away, to silence the inconvenient truth of their bond while he secured his future with another, the beautiful cage suddenly felt much, much smaller. Chapter 8. Instinct and Ash. The fortress library was Aria's only sanctuary. It was a cavernous, silent space filled with the dry, papery scent of history and forgotten knowledge. Here, at least, she could pretend she was just a girl again, losing herself in stories instead of being trapped in one. She was tracing the faded lettering on the spine of an old book when the air in the room shifted. A familiar cold, a prickle of intense awareness washed over her skin. She didn't need to turn to know that Rowan had entered. He moved with a predator's silence, his presence a heavy weight that seemed to suck the warmth from the room. He walked to a large table covered in maps, his back to her, completely ignoring her existence. The tension was a living creature between them, coiling in the silence, waiting to strike. That's when the chaos erupted. A sharp cry from the corridor outside, followed by the unmistakable violent clang of steel on steel. The library doors burst open. Two wolves, their faces contorted in snarling rage and their eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light, lunged into the room. They weren't wearing the king's silver and black. Their armor was cruder, marked with the faded symbol of a rogue clan Rowan had supposedly eradicated months ago. They moved with a desperate, suicidal speed. They were here for him. Rowan didn't hesitate. He was a blur of motion, a shadow of lethal grace. He met the first assassin's blade with a map-weighted scroll case, the sound a dull thud, before drawing a dagger from his boot in a single, fluid movement. The library became a whirlwind of flashing steel and guttural snarls. He was magnificent, a warrior in his element, but there were two of them. While he parried a furious assault from the first, the second broke away, circling around with a long, cruelly curved dagger glinting with a sickly green poison. He was aiming for Rowan's unprotected back. Time seemed to slow, to thicken like honey. Aria's mind went blank. There was no thought, no fear, only a white-hot primal roar that surged up from the deepest part of her soul. Mine. Her wolf, so long suppressed, took control. With a strangled cry, she ripped the heaviest book she could find from a nearby shelf, a dense, leather-bound history of the first alphas, and hurled it with all her strength. The heavy tome flew through the air and smashed into the side of the second assassin's head with a sickening crack. The blow didn't stop him, but it staggered him. He stumbled, his aim faltering for one crucial, breathtaking second. That second was all Rowan needed. He spun out of his engagement with the first attacker, his own blade a silver arc of death, and drove it deep into the second assassin's chest. The man collapsed in a heap as Rowan whirled back to face the first, dispatching him with a ruthless efficiency that stole Aria's breath. Silence. Heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the ragged sound of their breathing and the drip, drip, drip of blood onto the stone floor. Rowan stood over the bodies, his chest rising and falling, his entire body thrumming with leftover adrenaline. Then he turned. His eyes, wide and wild, the pupils blown so large they almost eclipsed the green, found her. It wasn't gratitude she saw. It was a storm, a terrifying tempest of shock, rage, and a raw primal possessiveness that stripped away the king and left only the wolf. He stalked toward her. Every step was deliberate, menacing. He backed her against a towering bookshelf, the hard spines of the books digging into her back. "What?" he snarled, his voice a low growl that vibrated through her bones. "Did you think you were doing?" He slammed his hand flat against the shelf next to her head, caging her in, his body a wall of heat and fury. His face was inches from hers, his scent, pine, storm, and fresh blood, overwhelming her. Before she could answer, before she could even breathe, he crashed his mouth down onto hers. It wasn't a kiss. It was a brand, a claim. A harsh, punishing, desperate act that tasted of fury and fear, and a terrifying, unspoken gratitude. Just as quickly, he tore himself away, leaving her gasping, her lips bruised and tingling. He stared at her for one more wild moment, then turned and stormed out of the library, the silence he left behind more violent than the fight itself. Chapter 9. The Game of Wolves. The echo of Rowan's kiss lingered on her lips, a phantom touch of fire and ice. Aria leaned against the bookshelf, her legs trembling, her mind reeling. The violence of it should have terrified her. Instead, it had sparked something deep within her. That kiss wasn't the act of a cold, indifferent king. It was the desperate act of a man hanging onto his control by a thread. It was rage and possession, yes, but it was also feeling. Raw, undeniable feeling. For the first time since his return, she had seen the wolf behind the man, and it gave her a dangerous, reckless surge of determination. She wouldn't let him hide from her. Not anymore. Seeking refuge from the suffocating confines of the fortress, she found her way to a small, secluded stone balcony that overlooked a private training courtyard. The cold mountain air was a balm on her heated skin. Below, several members of Rowan's council were gathered, their dark forms stark against the gray flagstones. She recognized the cunning, withered face of Lord Valerius, a powerful alpha whose pack had been one of the first to bend the knee to Rowan. Cale stood beside him, a silent, imposing statue. Their voices, sharp and clear in the cold air, drifted up to her. "Today proves it," Valerius was saying, his tone laced with a smooth, condescending logic. "Her presence is a liability, a weakness our enemies can and will exploit." Another lord, a stout man with a grizzled beard, nodded in agreement. He was distracted. If she hadn't been there, he never would have been caught off guard. She is a ghost from a past that he needs to bury if his reign is to survive. Aria went cold. They were talking about her. Not as a person, but as a strategic problem. "Perhaps," Valerius continued, a sly glint in his eye, "this is a test, a way to see where the king's priorities lie. Does he serve the kingdom or his sentimentality? We must press the issue. Force him to choose." The words struck her with a chilling clarity. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was a pawn in their deadly game of power. They wanted to use her to manipulate him, to test his strength, to undermine his rule. A fierce, defiant anger surged through her, eclipsing her fear. She had survived the death of her mate, 5 years of crushing loneliness and the shock of his return. She would not be broken by the political machinations of these old, power-hungry wolves. This was a new kind of war, and she would learn how to fight it. That evening, the opportunity came. At a formal assembly in the Great Hall, the air was thick with unspoken tension. The entire court had heard of the assassination attempt, and the whispers about her involvement followed her like a shadow. Lord Valerius, bold and calculating, stepped forward and addressed the throne. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice ringing with false deference. "The council and I have concerns regarding your guest." He gestured vaguely in Aria's direction. "Her undefined position in this court creates an instability we can ill afford. It projects an image of weakness. A king cannot be ruled by sentiment." It was a public, direct challenge, a gauntlet thrown at Rowan's feet, using her as the weapon. The hall fell into a dead silence. Every eye was on Rowan, waiting. They expected him to dismiss her, to put her in her place, to choose his kingdom over the girl from his past. Rowan, who had been listening from his granite throne with a terrifying stillness, let the silence stretch until it was a physical weight on the room. Slowly, deliberately, he rose to his full, imposing height. His glacial gaze swept over the court, lingering on Valerius with an expression of pure, lethal promise. Finally, his eyes found Aria's, holding her captive across the vast hall. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a blade of ice, absolute and unbreakable. "Her position," he declared, his gaze never leaving hers, "is not undefined." A dangerous beat of silence. "She is my mate. Let any who question that fact address their concerns to me. Directly." He had just shielded her, but in doing so, he had locked them both into a cage of his own making, declaring a new kind of war on his own court. Chapter 10. The edge of the blade, Rowan's declaration, "She is my mate," had detonated in the Great Hall, and the stunned silence was its fallout. Now, days later, the echoes of that explosion still ricocheted through the fortress corridors. Aria felt it in the way the court now looked at her. The open hostility had been replaced by something far more dangerous. A sharp, calculating assessment. She was no longer just a ghost. She was a recognized power, a piece on the board with a name, and that made her a target. The King's Mate. The title was a shield in one hand and a knife in the other, and she had no idea how to wield either. She felt both empowered by his claim and utterly trapped by it, because he had bound her to his side without once asking what she wanted. He had summoned her to a meeting of his war council. The chamber was a stark, circular room dominated by a massive stone table carved with a map of the continent. The air was thick with the scent of old leather, wood smoke, and the cold metallic tang of wolfish aggression. Lord Valerius was there, his thin lips pressed into a perpetual sneer of disapproval. Kale stood like a gargoyle at Rowan's shoulder. Aria was given a seat near the king, a place of honor that felt more like an interrogation chair. She knew she was meant to be a silent symbol of his authority, the living proof of his declaration. Rowan, however, had underestimated the girl who had spent 5 years learning to survive in silence. The topic was a dispute with the Granite Creek clan, a stubborn pack nestled in the western foothills. They were refusing to send their required tithe of preserved meat and grain to the capital, a clear act of defiance. "They are a proud, foolish people," Valerius stated, his voice a dry rasp. "They mock your authority, my king. A swift, brutal example must be made. Burn their granaries, salt their fields. Let the other border packs see the price of defiance." Several other lords nodded in agreement, their faces hard. Their solution to everything was fire and blood. It was the only language of power they seemed to understand. Aria listened, and a cold dread filled her. She thought of her own small pack, of the fear of starvation during a harsh winter. This clan wasn't just being defiant. They were likely terrified of not having enough to feed their own children. This was not a challenge to his crown. It was a desperate act of survival. Before she could stop herself, she spoke. Or perhaps they are simply afraid. The entire council turned to stare at her. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the hearth. Valerius let out a soft, condescending chuckle. "The King's Mate has a soft heart. How quaint." Rowan's gaze was fixed on her, his expression unreadable, but he didn't silence her. That was all the permission she needed. She stood, her hands resting on the back of her chair to keep them from trembling. "Fear doesn't build loyalty," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It builds resentment. You crush them now, and their sons and daughters will nurse a grudge that will fester for generations. You will create an enemy on your border forever." "And what would you suggest, little dove?" Valerius sneered. "We send them flowers, and you send them a better offer," she countered, her eyes flashing. She looked directly at Rowan, speaking to him alone. "You have warriors. You have patrols. They are a small clan in a dangerous territory. Offer them the king's protection. Send your guard to secure their borders from rogues and rival clans in exchange for their tithe. Don't take from them, trade with them. You won't get a resentful, conquered people. You will gain a grateful, loyal ally who will fight for the king who shields them." The idea was so simple, so contrary to their brutal politics, that the council was left speechless. It was a strategy built on empathy, not domination. Valerius opened his mouth to protest, a furious glint in his old eyes. But Rowan raised a single hand. The gesture was small, yet it carried an absolute authority that silenced the lord instantly. Rowan's cold green eyes remained locked on Aria. The surprise in them was undeniable, but it was mingled with something else, a flicker of respect, of intrigue. He was seeing her for the first time not as the girl he had lost, or the complication he had found, but as a mind, a voice, a potential equal. He didn't give her an answer. He simply moved the meeting onto the next topic. But the shift in the room was palpable. A new tension had been born, a dangerous and exhilarating current of energy that now flowed directly between the king on his throne and the mate who had dared to challenge him. Chapter 11. The Scars. He hides sleep was a luxury Aria could no longer afford. Her mind was a battlefield of its own, replaying the council meeting, the look in Rowan's eyes, the simmering hatred from Valerius. The kiss in the library was a phantom burn on her lips. She was tangled in a web of politics and passion so complex she couldn't see a single thread clearly. Desperate for a breath of air that wasn't thick with intrigue, she slipped out of her chambers. The fortress was a labyrinth of cold stone and deep shadows, utterly silent in the dead of night. She walked without a destination, letting her feet carry her away from the opulent wing of the royal court and into the older, more utilitarian sections of the mountain stronghold. A faint light flickered from beneath a heavy oak door at the end of a long, unused corridor. Curiosity, a dangerous impulse in this place, pulled her forward. The air here was different, tinged with the metallic scent of old blood and the bitter aroma of healing salves. It was a forgotten infirmary. Pushing the heavy door open a crack, she peered inside, and her heart stopped. Rowan stood in the center of the room, his back to her. He was stripped to the waist, a length of clean linen in one hand as he dabbed at a wound high on his shoulder, a gash from the assassin's blade that must have reopened. The moonlight slanting through a high, grimy window painted his skin in shades of silver and shadow. But it wasn't the fresh injury that made the air leave her lungs in a silent rush. It was his back. It was not the smooth, strong back of the boy she remembered. It was a ruined landscape of pain, a testament to a horror she couldn't begin to imagine. A crosshatch of faded white lines from a whip overlaid deeper, puckered scars that could only have come from a blade. Near his shoulder was a dark, ugly brand, the sigil of a rival pack known for their cruelty. His skin was a canvas of healed agony. And in that moment, 5 years of anger, of feeling abandoned, of righteous indignation, it all evaporated, replaced by a wave of devastating, soul-crushing understanding. He must have sensed her. He stiffened, his entire body going rigid. He moved to grab his discarded tunic, a motion filled with a desperate, gut-wrenching shame. "Get out!" he rasped, his voice thick and raw. Aria didn't move. She couldn't. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his ravaged form. "Rowan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I said get out!" he roared, whirling to face her. The fury in his eyes was a shield, a weak and crumbling defense against the utter vulnerability of being seen. His face was a mask of torment. She took a step forward, then another, ignoring his warning growl. She wasn't afraid of his anger, she was heartbroken by the pain that fueled it. "The rogue attack," she began, her voice barely audible. You weren't killed." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that held no humor. "Killed? No. Death would have been a mercy." He finally looked at her, and the agony in his gaze was a physical blow. "I was sold, Aria. Betrayed by one of our own, handed over to the very monsters who supposedly killed me. They kept me for months. They wanted to break me, to turn me into an animal." The truth crashed into her, rearranging the entire world. His coldness, his brutality, his impenetrable walls. They weren't choices, they were scars, the same as the ones that littered his back. He had shut himself off not to punish her, but to survive the unsurvivable. He had clawed his way out of hell, and the only way to keep the demons at bay was to become colder and harder than the stone of his cell. She closed the final distance between them, her hand rising, trembling, to touch the edge of a particularly nasty scar on his side. He flinched but didn't pull away. Her touch was feather-light, reverent. "The boy I knew," he choked out, his voice cracking, "died in that place." "No," she whispered, her tears finally falling, tracing hot paths down her cheeks. She looked up, meeting his tormented gaze. He just forgot how to live. The dam broke. With a sound that was half groan, half sob, he pulled her into him, his arms wrapping around her like steel bands. His mouth found hers, and this time there was no anger, no punishment. It was a desperate, raw collision of two broken souls searching for a piece of themselves in the other. It was the taste of salt and sorrow and a desperate, burning need. It wasn't about passion. It was about connection, a frantic, unspoken promise that even after the deepest darkness, you could still find your way home. Chapter 12. A Bond of Fire and Steel. In the quiet aftermath, wrapped in furs before a low-burning fire in his private chambers, the world felt still. For the first time since his return, the glacial fortress around Rowan's heart had thawed, and Aria saw glimpses of the man she had mourned. He held her hand, his thumb tracing patterns over her knuckles, the simple, tender gesture a revelation. The silence between them wasn't empty or tense. It was filled with a fragile, unspoken understanding. The king was gone, at least for this stolen moment, and the boy who had been lost in the darkness was looking at her with eyes that held a universe of pain, but also a flicker of long-forgotten hope. "I built this kingdom on fear and strength," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear, "because I swore no one would ever have that kind of power over me again." He looked around at the cold stone walls, at the symbols of his might. But it's empty. A throne is a cold companion. This newfound intimacy was a balm to her soul, but Aria knew it was also a lit match in a room full of gunpowder. Their connection, now laid bare, was a vulnerability that his enemies would not ignore, and they did not have to wait long. The next day, Lord Valerius requested a public audience with the king, citing a matter of urgent kingdom security. The great hall was filled, the court buzzing with a tense energy. Aria stood near the throne, a position that now felt both right and terrifyingly exposed. Valerius strode to the center of the hall, his face a mask of grim determination. He was not alone. Behind him stood an envoy from the Sunstone Pack, their golden banners a stark contrast to the black and silver of Rowan's court. "Your Majesty," Valerius began, his voice ringing with theatrical gravity. "For weeks, we have spoken of the necessity of an alliance with the South. We have spoken of the strength such a union would bring. It is time for action, not sentiment." He turned and took a heavy, rolled parchment tied with a golden ribbon from the Sunstone envoy. He held it up for all to see. "This is the marriage contract, signed and sealed by the Alpha of the Sunstone Pack. He offers you his daughter, Lyra, and the might of his legions. All it requires is your signature. All it requires is that you set aside this distraction." His meaning was clear. He was forcing a public ultimatum. Choose the girl or choose your kingdom. A wave of murmurs swept through the court. It was a masterful political stroke, backing Rowan into a corner in front of all his subjects. Aria's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. This was it. He would have to choose his duty. He had built this entire kingdom. He couldn't let it falter for her. She prepared herself for the crushing, inevitable blow. Rowan was unnervingly still on his throne. He looked at Valerius, at the contract, and then his gaze moved to Aria. It was a long, deep look, filled with an intensity that made the rest of the world fall away. In his eyes, she saw the boy in the infirmary, the king on the throne, and the wolf that was both. He was making a decision that would change everything. Slowly, he rose from his throne and descended the dais. He walked not to Valerius, but to a large, ornate brazier burning near the steps. He held out his hand. The contract. A triumphant smirk touched Valerius's lips as he handed the parchment over, believing he had won. Rowan took the scroll. He held it for a moment, his knuckles white. Then, in one smooth, deliberate motion, he thrust it into the heart of the flames. The parchment blackened, curled, and was consumed by fire, the golden ribbon melting away like a dying snake. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. He turned to face a stunned Valerius, his voice dangerously soft, yet carrying to every corner of the room. My strength does not come from contracts, my lord. It does not come from political alliances. He turned his burning gaze back to Aria. It comes from my mate. It was a declaration of love. It was a confession of need. It was an act of political suicide. He had chosen her. In the stunned silence that followed, Rowan strode to her side, his hand finding hers, his fingers lacing through hers in a gesture of unbreakable unity. But as he led her from the hall, away from the shocked and furious eyes of his court, she saw the grim set of his jaw. The brief thaw from the night before was gone, replaced by the hard reality of his choice. He pulled her into a private alcove, his expression dark with the weight of his actions. "What I just did," he said, his voice low and urgent, "was not just for us. It was a message. But it has started a war within these walls. They will see you as the reason for it. You are not safe here anymore. No one is." They were united, their bond forged anew in fire and steel. But in doing so, they had just painted a target on their own backs. Chapter 13. The War Within. The heavy oak door of the strategy room slammed shut, the sound echoing the finality of Rowan's choice. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the weight of the war he had just declared. He didn't release her hand. Instead, his grip tightened, a desperate anchor in a storm of his own making. He pulled her toward the massive map table, its surface a carved continent of alliances and enmities. The world he had fought so hard to conquer was now a landscape of threats aimed directly at them. He was no longer just a king defending his borders. He was a man defending his mate, and in this court, that was the more dangerous battle. "Valerius is not just an old wolf with a grudge," Rowan began, his voice a low, urgent hum that vibrated through the floor. He tapped a region on the map marked with the crest of a striking viper. "He has the loyalty of the Serpent Fang clan. He has trade agreements with the Eastern Pax." He traced lines with his finger, connecting factions, revealing the intricate web of power Valerius had woven within the kingdom. My declaration in the hall? It was a spark. Valerius will use it to light a fire. He will paint me as a sentimental fool, a king ruled by a weakness for a ghost. He will convince them that I am unfit to rule. He was showing her everything. Not just his strength, but his vulnerability. The cracks in his armor were now visible, and he was trusting her not to press on them, but to help him seal them. This was more intimate than any touch, more binding than any kiss. This was his commitment, laid bare on a table of war. He was making her a partner in his reign, not just a feature of it. A fierce, protective resolve surged through Aria, extinguishing the last of her fear. She would not be the weakness that brought him down. She would not be a damsel in the tower, waiting for the outcome of a war fought in her name. She had a mind. She had a will. And she had knowledge that these hardened warriors, blinded by their thirst for power and dominance, had long since forgotten. "You see them as soldiers and traitors," she said, her voice quiet but firm, drawing his intense gaze. "But I see them as packs, as families. You want to stop Valerius? Don't just fight his warriors, win over his people. You know how to command loyalty through fear. I know how to earn it through hope." She straightened, her chin lifting. "But I can't do that if I am a liability. I won't be one." Rowan's brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," she declared, her voice ringing with a strength she hadn't known she possessed, "that you need to teach me how to fight, not just with words in a council meeting, with a blade. With my own 2 hands. I saved you once by instinct. The next time I want it to be by design. I refuse to be the fragile piece in your game. I will be your queen." The surprise on his face was profound, quickly followed by a dark, tumultuous storm of conflicting emotions. She saw the fierce, primal need to protect her warring with the undeniable truth of her words. He saw the fire in her, the same resilience that had allowed her to survive 5 years alone, and he recognized it as a power equal to his own. The cost of their bond was becoming clearer now. For him, it meant sharing the crushing weight of his crown. For her, It meant stepping out of the quiet world of a healer and into the brutal, bloody arena of his court, willingly embracing the pain and the sacrifice that came with it. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, the decision made. "Kale will train you," he said, his voice rough. "He is the best. He will not be gentle." "I don't expect him to be," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "Winter is coming. It's time I learned how to sharpen my own claws." Chapter 14. Lessons in Fire. The training yard was a stark expanse of packed earth and splintered wood, smelling of sweat, steel, and old resentments. Kale, the scarred and silent warrior who served as Rowan's shadow, regarded Aria with undisguised skepticism. He saw her as a distraction, a frivolous sentimentality his king could ill afford, and he intended to prove it. The first few days were a brutal education in her own limitations. The wooden practice sword felt heavy and clumsy in her hands. Her muscles screamed in protest, her body a canvas of blooming bruises. Kyle was relentless, his instructions clipped and impersonal, his movements a blur of deadly efficiency she could barely track. He pushed her, testing her stamina, her resolve, her pain threshold. He wanted her to quit. But Aria did not quit. Every time he knocked her down, she got back up, mud-streaked and gasping for breath, the fire in her eyes burning a little brighter. She had survived a broken heart. She could survive this. She learned to anticipate, to pivot, to use her smaller size as an advantage for speed rather than a disadvantage in strength. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to transform. The healer's gentle hands were becoming calloused, learning the lethal memory of the blade. This was the price of her commitment, paid for in sweat and agony, and with every grueling session, she felt a new kind of power awakening within her. Rowan watched. He would often stand on the stone overlook above the yard, never interfering, never speaking, but his presence was a constant, silent pressure. It was both a comfort and a torment. Aria fought harder under his gaze, wanting to prove herself worthy of the faith he had placed in her. For Rowan, it was a special kind of hell. It was one thing to know she needed to be strong. It was another to watch the man he trusted most in the world inflict the very pain he longed to shield her from. During one particularly intense session, Kale swept her legs out from under her. She landed hard, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. Before she could recover, the blunted tip of his practice sword was at her throat. "Too slow," he grunted. "In a real fight, you would be dead." A low, rumbling growl echoed from the overlook. It was not loud, but it was filled with such primal, lethal intent that the very air in the yard seemed to crackle. Kale froze, his eyes widening slightly as he looked up. Rowan stood rigid, his hands clenched into fists on the stone railing, the king's composure momentarily shattered by the wolf's raw, possessive instinct. He mastered himself a second later, his expression once again a mask of ice, but the warning had been delivered. Kyle stepped back, giving Aria a moment to breathe. Later that evening, in the privacy of their chambers, Rowan tended to the deep purple bruise on her shoulder. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of her training. "He is pushing you too hard," he said, his voice a low growl. "He is teaching me what I need to know," she replied, her voice soft but firm. She didn't flinch as his fingers traced the edge of the bruise. This strange ritual had become a part of their new life, the pain of the day soothed by the tenderness of the night. It was in these quiet moments that their bond deepened, forged in a strange crucible of violence and vulnerability. "Kyle doesn't trust me," she added, watching his face. Rowan's expression darkened. "Kyle learned to distrust everyone after the first betrayal," he murmured, almost to himself. "It taught us all that the deepest wounds are dealt by a familiar hand." His words hung in the air, a cryptic and unsettling reminder. The person who had sold him out 5 years ago, the one who had started this entire nightmare, was still a ghost in their lives, a faceless monster whose identity remained a secret. The danger wasn't just on the borders or in the council room. It was a poison that had seeped into the very foundation of his trust, and Aria realized with a chill that they were fighting a war on a battlefield they couldn't even see. Chapter 15. A Plague of Whispers. The political situation in the fortress was deteriorating faster than the first winter snows could fall. Lord Valerius, thwarted in his public maneuvering, had resorted to a more insidious form of warfare: whispers. He and his faction began to sow seeds of dissent throughout the court, their poison dripping into the ears of nobles, guards, and servants alike. They painted Aria as a foreign entity, a curse, the source of the king's distraction and the court's instability. Every sideways glance and hushed conversation felt like a new threat, and the fortress that had once felt like a cold prison now felt like a hunting ground where she was the prey. The true masterstroke of Valerius's plan came without warning. A sickness began to sweep through the lower levels of the keep. It started with a handful of kitchen staff, then spread to the guards' barracks. It was a vicious, debilitating affliction that brought a burning fever and a racking cough, weakening dozens of Rowan's people within a matter of days. Panic, a far more contagious disease, followed swiftly. Aria, hearing of the illness, immediately went to the infirmary, her healer's instincts taking over. She recognized some of the symptoms, but not all. The progression was too fast, too aggressive. She brought her own stores of herbs, preparing remedies to soothe the fevers and ease the breathing of the afflicted. She worked tirelessly, her hands once again those of a healer, not a warrior. This was the opening Valerius had been waiting for. On the third day of the outbreak, he stood before a terrified assembly of the court, a grieving mother at his side whose young son, a stable hand, was now gravely ill. The sickness started shortly after the king's mate began her work here, Valerius announced, his voice oozing with false sympathy. She brings strange herbs from the outside. She prepares concoctions no one understands. We welcomed a stray, and she has brought a plague upon us. The accusation was ludicrous, yet it landed on fertile ground of fear and suspicion. The whispers became shouts. The suspicious glances turned into open glares of hatred. They called her a witch, a curse. The very people she was trying to help now recoiled from her touch. She was completely, terrifyingly alone, isolated in a sea of hostile faces. The entire fortress, it seemed, had turned against her. Rowan was forced to act. To ignore the public outcry would be to lose control of his court entirely. He convened a public hearing, his face a mask of cold, impartial authority. Aria stood before him, not as his mate, but as the accused. She watched as Valerius presented his evidence, a collection of innocuous herbs from her stores, now twisted to look like poisons. He spoke of the unnatural influence she held over the king. It was a flawless performance, and it was swaying the court. Rowan listened to it all, his expression unreadable, his green eyes like chips of ice. When Valerius was finished, the king rendered his judgment, his voice ringing with chilling authority. "The evidence is compelling," he stated, his words a death knell to Aria's heart. "The panic must be contained. Until the source of this sickness can be determined beyond all doubt, you," he said, his gaze finally pinning Aria, "will be confined to your chambers, under guard, for the protection of all." The crowd murmured its approval. Their king was being just. He was choosing them. But Aria saw the truth. In his eyes, behind the mask of the cold king, she saw the desperate agony of the man. This wasn't a punishment. It was a desperate, dangerous gambit. To appease the court and buy himself time to find the real culprit, he had to publicly side against her. It was an act of seeming betrayal designed to save her life. But as the guards stepped forward to escort her away, trapping her once more, she felt the crushing weight of their new reality. They were utterly, completely isolated, a king and his queen fighting a war on two separate fronts, and for the first time she felt all hope begin to crumble. Chapter 16. The Kindness of Snakes Confined. The word was a dull, throbbing ache behind Aria's ribs. She paced the length of her opulent prison, the silken carpets doing nothing to soften the hard reality of her situation. 2 royal guards, loyal to Rowan and not the council, stood outside her door. They were her protectors and her jailers, a walking contradiction that defined her new existence. She trusted Rowan. She had to cling to that belief with white-knuckled desperation. He was working, hunting for the truth, and this imprisonment was a necessary shield. But the trust was a flickering candle in a rising, bitter wind of doubt and fear. Each passing hour felt like a lifetime, the silence of the fortress a scream she could almost hear. Later that evening, a soft scratching sound came from a tapestry on the far wall. It depicted a grim, ancient battle, a scene of chaos and betrayal. The tapestry moved aside, revealing a small hidden door and the pale, terrified face of a young servant girl named Alina. She was one of the few who had shown Aria any kindness, a quiet girl who worked in the kitchens. "My lady," she whispered, her voice trembling as she slipped into the room, her eyes wide with panic. "You must come now, there is no time." Aria's heart leaped into her throat. "Elena, what is it? What's happened?" "It's Lord Valerius," the girl choked out, twisting the fabric of her apron in her hands. "The king. He's gone." A rider came with an urgent summons from the western garrison. A rogue army was spotted near the pass. The king had to ride out with his personal guard not an hour ago. The words struck Aria with the force of a physical blow. Gone? Rowan had left her here, alone, in a fortress teeming with vipers. The candle of trust sputtered violently. "Valerius has taken command of the keep," Alina rushed on, her words tumbling over each other in her terror. "He is purging it. Anyone loyal to the king is being locked in the dungeons. He said the plague must have a source, and he will cut it out tonight." Her gaze was filled with a dreadful meaning. "He means you, my lady. He plans to have you killed in your sleep, to make it look as if the sickness finally took you. I heard him telling his men." The cold dread that washed over Aria was absolute, abandoned. Rowan had chosen his kingdom, his duty, and left her to the wolves. The pain of it was a sharp, jagged thing, worse than any physical wound. "But there is a way," Alina whispered, her expression pleading. "My grandfather was a mason here. He built these walls. There are passages, secret ways out of the fortress. I can get you to the woods. You can run. You can be free." This was the betrayal. Not Alina's, but Rowan's. He had left her. He had sacrificed her. The realization settled in her soul, heavy and cold as a tombstone. She had to survive. She had learned long ago that she could only rely on herself. She looked at the young girl, at her earnest, frightened face, the only kindness she had seen in days. She had no other choice. "Show me the way," Aria said, her voice a dead, hollow thing. The last flicker of hope, the foolish, stubborn belief in him, was finally extinguished. She was alone again, and this time, the ghost she was running from was not just a memory, but a living king who had let her fall. Chapter 17. The Bottom of the Well. The secret passages were a claustrophobic nightmare, a spiderweb of tunnels burrowing through the mountain's cold stone heart. The air was stale, thick with the scent of damp earth and centuries of forgotten secrets. Alina led the way, a small flickering lantern casting their shadows into monstrous, dancing shapes against the rough-hewn walls. Aria followed, her mind a numb cacophony of grief and adrenaline. Every step was a step away from Rowan, from the life she had briefly, foolishly allowed herself to imagine. Her focus narrowed to a single primal instinct: survive. Just survive. They moved in silence, the only sounds the scuff of their boots on the gritty floor and the frantic, desperate beating of Aria's own heart. The passage began to slope upwards, and she could feel a faint, cool draft on her skin, carrying the scent of pine and night air. Freedom. It was close. A desperate, ragged hope began to claw its way through the numbness. Alina pushed open a heavy stone block disguised as part of a wall, revealing a small, secluded courtyard bathed in the cold light of the moon. "This way," the girl whispered, gesturing toward a far gate that led into the dark woods beyond. "We're almost there." Aria took a step out into the open, her eyes fixed on the promise of the forest. And then she froze. A figure stepped out from the shadows of a stone archway, Lord Valerius. His lips were curled into a triumphant, reptilian smile. He was not alone. A dozen of his personal guard, their swords drawn and glinting in the moonlight, moved to surround them, blocking the gate, blocking all escape. "My lady," Valerius purred, his voice dripping with mock courtesy. "Leaving so soon, and without saying goodbye." Aria's gaze snapped to Alina. The young servant girl was weeping, her body trembling uncontrollably. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed, backing away from Aria and toward the guards. "He has my family. He promised he wouldn't hurt them if I—" Her words trailed off into a heartbroken wail. The kindness had been a lie. The escape was a trap. The last vestiges of Aria's trust in anyone or anything crumbled to dust. "You see," Valerius said, stepping closer, circling her like a patient vulture, "you are far more valuable to me as bait than as a corpse." He savored her stunned silence, his eyes glittering with a cruel, ancient malice. "Oh, did you really believe your king abandoned you? How little faith you have." A cold, new terror, far worse than her own, began to dawn in Aria's mind. "What did you do?" she breathed. "The summons from the Western garrison was a work of fiction, of course," he explained with a dismissive wave of his hand. "A carefully crafted lie to draw him out. I must admit, he took the bait more eagerly than I expected. So desperate to protect his precious borders." Valerius's smile widened, becoming something truly monstrous. He rode out looking for a rogue army. Instead, he found the Crimson Fang Pack, or what's left of them, the very beasts whose brand he carries on his back. They were most eager for a reunion. The world tilted, the ground falling away beneath her feet. It wasn't a betrayal. It was a sacrifice. Rowan hadn't abandoned her. He had ridden into a trap to protect his kingdom, a trap Valerius had set for him. Her imprisonment hadn't been to appease the court. It had been to keep her safe while he was gone. And she, in her fear and doubt, had walked right into the enemy's hands. Chapter 18. A Sky Without Stars. Valerius's victory was absolute, and he reveled in it. He seized Aria's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons, and dragged her from the courtyard, up a winding set of stairs to the highest battlements of the fortress. The wind was a mournful howl this high up, whipping her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. The night was vast and starless, a suffocating blanket of black. Valerius forced her to the edge of the parapet, the sheer drop below a dizzying promise of oblivion. "Look," he commanded, gesturing out into the darkness. Far below, at the base of the mountain pass, she could see them, the distant, angry orange sparks of torches, like a swarm of angry fireflies. Faintly, so faintly she could hear the ghostly echo of shouting, the thin, sharp cry of steel ringing on steel. A battle. Rowan's battle. "It is a beautiful sight, is it not?" Valerius mused, his voice filled with a chilling, poetic madness. The sound of a king falling. He leaned in close, his breath a foul cloud of rot and triumph against her ear. "You think this is about a throne? About your king's foolish sentimentality? Oh no. This is much older than that. This is about a debt 5 years overdue." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, a shard of ice sliding into her heart. "It was you," she whispered, the words stolen by the wind. "The betrayal. 5 years ago. It was always you." "Of course it was me," he hissed, his face contorting with a sudden venomous rage. He was a boy, a foolish, optimistic boy, full of talk of peace and unity. He was going to squander the power his father had built. I gave him to the Crimson Fang to be broken, to be taught a lesson. But the boy had too much iron in him. He survived, he escaped, and he returned, not as a broken wolf, but as a king stronger than I could have ever imagined. He took everything that should have been mine. Valerius's grip tightened, his knuckles white. Tonight, I am simply correcting my past mistake. He was the ghost, the source of all their pain, the architect of her grief and Rowan's torment. The monster had been living inside the walls the entire time. As if on cue, there was a commotion at the stairwell door. 2 of Valerius's guards appeared, dragging a brutalized figure between them. They threw him to the stone floor at Valerius's feet. It was Kale. His face was a swollen, bloody mask, his silver and black armor dented and torn. But his eyes, when they found Aria, were filled with an unbroken, defiant fire. He coughed, spitting a glob of blood onto the stones. "The king," he choked out, his voice a ragged, painful rasp. He glared at Valerius with a hatred so pure it was terrifying. "He fought like a god. He bought us time." Kale's gaze flickered back to the distant battle. But they were too many. They overwhelmed the guard. "Valerius, your trap worked." His final words were a curse. "They have him." The confirmation was a physical blow, knocking the last breath of hope from Aria's body. Captured. Rowan was captured, in the hands of the very monsters who had tortured him for months. Valerius let out a triumphant laugh that was swallowed by the wind. He stood silhouetted against the dark sky, the master of his creation. Aria stared out at the dying embers of the battle below, a prisoner of the man who had destroyed her world twice over. Her mate was in the hands of his torturers. His kingdom was falling, and the sky above her was utterly, completely devoid of stars. Chapter 19. The Queen of Ember's despair was a bottomless well, and Aria was sinking through its cold, dark water. Valerius's triumphant laughter echoed in her ears, a soundtrack to the ruin of her world. On the stones below, Kale was a broken testament to their failure. In the distance, the last embers of Rowan's battle were dying out. She had lost. Everything she had found, everything she had fought for, was gone. The grief was so absolute, so heavy, it threatened to crush the very breath from her lungs. She felt a familiar emptiness yawn open inside her, the same hollow ache that had been her only companion for 5 long years. But as she looked at Valerius, at his smug, gloating face, something else stirred in the depths of that well. It was not hope. It was something harder, sharper, and far more dangerous. It was rage, a cold, silent fury that began to burn away the grief. She thought of the scars on Rowan's back, a map of the pain this man had authored. She thought of his face in the infirmary, the shame and torment in his eyes. Valerius hadn't just defeated a king. He had taken pleasure in breaking the boy she had loved. He had orchestrated every moment of their suffering. And in that instant, the girl who had survived on quiet resilience died. The healer who soothed pain withered away. The frightened captive vanished. On the windswept battlements of a falling kingdom, a queen was born from the ashes of a broken heart. She understood his weakness now. Valerius was a master of grand strategies, of moving armies and plotting betrayals. He was so focused on the king, the great wolf on the board, that he had never, not for a single moment, considered the pawn. He saw her as a prize, a symbol, a weakness to be exploited. He did not see the weapon she had become. Her mind, once clouded with sorrow, was now a lens of perfect, ice-cold clarity. She remembered the small leather pouch Alara had given her, still tucked safely inside her tunic. "For calming the spirit," the old woman had said, but her eyes had held a deeper meaning. Aria's fingers brushed against it. She knew every herb inside: St. John's wort for anxiety, lavender for sleep, and a small, carefully wrapped packet of finely ground wolfsbane root, mixed with the pollen of the ghost orchid. Individually, potent. Together, when burned, a noxious cloud that would assault a wolf's hypersensitive senses, causing disorientation, dizziness, and blinding pain. She needed a diversion, a moment of chaos. With a choked, desperate cry that sounded utterly convincing, she collapsed to her knees, feigning a wave of hopeless despair. "He's gone," she wailed, her body shaking with manufactured sobs. "You've killed him!" Valerius turned to her, his expression one of indulgent satisfaction. There, little dove," he purred, stepping closer. "Your king is gone, but you still have a purpose to serve." It was the opening she needed. As he loomed over her, she fumbled with the pouch, her movements hidden by her heaving shoulders. In one swift, fluid motion, she rose up, not in surrender, but in attack. She didn't throw the contents at him. Instead, she spun and flung the entire handful of volatile powder into the ornate brazier that burned nearby, its flames a beacon in the dark. The effect was instantaneous. The powder ignited with a violent whoosh, sending up a plume of thick, acrid, greenish-white smoke. The scent was unnaturally sweet and cloying. To a human, it would have been merely unpleasant. To the werewolves on the battlement, it was an agony. Valerius recoiled with a strangled snarl, his hands flying to his nose and eyes. The guards staggered back, coughing and disoriented, their heightened senses turned into instruments of torture. The world dissolved into a choking, blinding fog. The queen had just made her first move. Chapter 20. A Shield of Wolves. The chaos was a living thing. The acrid smoke billowed across the battlements, a blinding, disorienting cloud that sent Valerius's guards reeling. They clawed at their faces, their powerful forms reduced to stumbling, choking wrecks. Valerius himself was snarling, his eyes streaming, fury and pain warring on his face. In that moment of pandemonium, Kyle, the battered but unbroken warrior, surged into motion. With a roar of pure hatred, he launched himself at the nearest guard, using the man's confusion to bring him down with a sickening crunch of bone. Aria did not run. The instinct to flee, the impulse that had defined her survival for years, was gone. She was a queen now, and a queen does not abandon her soldiers. She scrambled to Cale's side, grabbing his arm. "Where?" she demanded, her voice sharp and clear above the cacophony. "Where did they take Rowan?" Cale wiped a smear of blood from his mouth, his eyes locking onto hers with a newfound, grudging respect. "The old dens," he gasped, his breathing ragged. "The cave system in the Shadow Maw ravine. It was the Crimson Fang's stronghold." Her mind raced, piecing together the map Rowan had shown her, the political landscape he had laid bare, the Shadow Maw ravine. It bordered the territory of the Granite Creek clan, the proud, stubborn people she had defended in the council meeting. It was a desperate, insane long shot, but it was the only shot she had. "We need to split up," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. She fumbled at Cale's belt, her fingers finding the heavy, ornate ring bearing the king's sigil. She pulled it from his finger. "You are his second in command. They will recognize your authority. You will go to the Granite Creek clan. You will show them this." She pressed the ring into his hand. "Tell them the king who offered them a shield from their enemies now needs a shield of his own. Tell them the woman who spoke for them now asks for their blades. Tell them if they fight for their king tonight, the alliance she promised will be forged in blood and honor and will last for 1,000 years. Cale stared at her, stunned, as if seeing her for the first time. He saw not a frightened girl, but a leader. He gave a single, sharp nod, a silent pledge of loyalty more powerful than any oath. "And you?" "I'm going to get my mate," she said, her voice laced with deadly resolve. They moved like ghosts through the chaos, using the choking smoke as cover. Kyle disappeared down a dark stairwell, a man on a desperate diplomatic mission. Aria went the other way, toward a small postern gate she had noted during her brief walks in the garden. She was alone, armed with nothing but a pouch of herbs and a sliver of an impossible plan. She ran, not away from the fortress but toward the battle. She plunged into the dark, twisted forest that surrounded the mountain, her feet sure on the uneven ground, her senses alive. The training, the pain, the bruises, it had all been for this. She was no longer running from her past. She was charging headlong toward her future, a future she would carve out of the darkness with her own 2 hands. The air was cold and sharp in her lungs, and for the first time in a long time she felt no fear. She was filled with a purpose so clear and so bright it burned away everything else. She was coming for her king. Chapter 21. The Heart of the Mountain. The entrance to the Shadow Maw ravine was a jagged wound in the mountainside, a place that reeked of old blood and misery. The Crimson Fang's den was a chaotic mess. The rogues, victorious and arrogant, were celebrating their capture of the Alpha King. The sounds of their crude revelry, drunken shouts and the gnawing of bones, echoed up from the depths of the cave system. Aria moved like a shadow along the ravine's edge, her small size a blessing, allowing her to slip past the 2 distracted sentries at the entrance. Inside, the air was hot and thick, with the stench of unwashed bodies and spilled ale. She used her knowledge of the wild, her senses sharp, to navigate the labyrinthine tunnels. She followed the loudest sounds, the trail of discarded wineskins and gnawed-on ribs, deeper into the heart of the mountain. Finally, she found him. In a large central cavern, illuminated by a dozen guttering torches, Rowan was chained to the far wall. His arms were stretched wide, the heavy iron manacles biting into his flesh. He was beaten, his face bruised and cut, his silver-black hair matted with blood. But he was not broken. His head was held high, his jaw set, and his eyes, when they caught the torchlight, burned with a defiant, untamed fire. The rogue Alpha, a massive, scarred brute named Gorgon, was taunting him, pacing before him like a jackal. "The great cold Alpha King," Gorgon sneered, landing a heavy blow to Rowan's gut. "Look at you now, chained like a dog in my kennel." Rowan just laughed, a low, breathy sound that was more terrifying than any snarl. "You needed an army and a traitor's trick to chain me, Gorgon. You are not a king. You are just a parasite." Aria knew she couldn't fight them, not like this, but she could give them chaos. Seeing several large barrels of oil for the lamps lining the cavern wall, a desperate plan formed. She uncorked the pouch from Alara one last time, taking out a small dried sprig of flash moss, a highly flammable plant. She crept along the shadows. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed the moss into the nearest torch. It ignited instantly, a ball of white-hot fire. Before anyone could react, she shoved the torch into the oily rags stuffed around the barrels. The explosion was a deafening roar. A wall of fire and thick black smoke erupted through the cavern. The rogues screamed, panic replacing their drunken arrogance. The celebration turned into a stampede as they scrambled to escape the choking, burning darkness. In the chaos, Aria sprinted to Rowan. "I'm here," she breathed, her hands already working on the heavy, crude locks of his manacles. "I'm here." He stared at her as if she were an apparition, a dream conjured from his pain. "Aria, you should not have come." "You should know by now," she grunted, putting all her weight into a rusted lever. "I don't do what I'm told." The lock sprang open. As she started on the other, Gorgon loomed out of the smoke, his face a mask of pure fury. "The little stray!" he roared, lunging for her. Chapter 22. The Traitor's Debt. The cavern was a vortex of fire, smoke, and steel. Around them, the battle raged, the disciplined war cries of the Granite Creek clan clashing with the desperate snarls of the cornered Crimson Fang. But in the center of the swirling chaos, the world narrowed to a single deadly point. Rowan and Aria stood back to back, a united island in a sea of violence, their attention fixed on the true architect of their pain, Lord Valerius. The old wolf's face was a mask of incandescent fury, his plans crumbling to ash around him. "You were always a disappointment, boy," Valerius spat, his voice cutting through the din of battle. He drew a wicked, curved blade, its edge gleaming in the firelight. "Full of pathetic notions like honor and love. I built your father's reign from the shadows. I taught him how to be strong. Power is not won with sentiment. It is taken with blood and bone. He lunged, not with the brute force of Gorgon, but with the cunning, precise movements of a duelist. Rowan, injured and weary, met his attack. Their blades sang a lethal song, sparks flying as steel met steel. Valerius was a venomous whirlwind, his words as sharp as his sword. He taunted Rowan with the past, whispering details of the original betrayal, of the gold he was paid, of the pleasure he took in hearing the reports of Rowan's suffering. It was a calculated psychological assault, designed to shatter Rowan's focus, to make him fight with rage instead of skill. And it was working. Rowan, driven by 5 years of buried agony, began to falter. He was fighting on pure instinct, his movements becoming ragged. Valerius saw his opening. With a feint that drew Rowan's guard high, the old wolf lunged low, his blade sinking deep into Rowan's side. Rowan cried out, a sharp, ragged gasp of pain, and staggered back, his hand flying to the gushing wound. He was stumbling, his strength finally failing him. This was it, the moment Valerius had waited for. The traitor raised his sword for the final, killing blow, a triumphant, hateful sneer twisting his features. He had won, but he had forgotten about the queen. In that split second, as the world slowed to a crawl, Aria moved. She was no match for him in a sword fight, but she didn't need to be. Her battlefield was different. Her weapons were different. She lunged forward under Valerius's guard, her movement a desperate, fluid prayer. In her hand, she palmed a small, wickedly sharp thorn she had coated in a potent paralytic paste, a secret gift from the heart of the forest. It was her last resort, her final secret. She didn't aim for a killing blow. She aimed for a nerve cluster in his thigh, a point of weakness she had learned from her healing texts. She slammed the thorn deep into his leg with all her weight. For a moment, nothing happened. Valerius looked down at her, a sneer of contempt on his face. Then his eyes widened in confusion. The sword felt heavy in his hand. His leg went numb, refusing to obey his commands. The fast-acting neurotoxin surged through his veins, a silent, invisible poison. He stumbled, his muscles locking, his body betraying him. The great political mastermind, the kingmaker and traitor, was brought down not by a sword, but by a flower's thorn and a healer's knowledge. He collapsed to the cavern floor, paralyzed and defeated, his face a mask of impotent rage. Aria stood over him, breathing heavily, no longer a victim, but the arbiter of his fate. Chapter 23. The Art of Healing. The last of the Crimson Fang fell, and a new kind of silence descended upon the cavern. It was the quiet of exhaustion, of victory, of survival. The Granite Creek warriors, led by a bloodied but triumphant Kale, were securing the prisoners, their faces etched with a fierce respect as they looked upon Aria and their king. But the moment the adrenaline faded, the price of their victory became terrifyingly clear. Rowan swayed on his feet, his face pale as ash, his hand pressed tight against the deep wound in his side. His eyes found Aria's, a silent message of pain and exhaustion passing between them. Then, his legs gave out, and he collapsed to the stony ground. Aria rushed to his side, her mind instantly shifting from warrior to healer. The queen receded, and the woman who knew the art of mending broken things took command. "Here!" she called out, her voice clear and authoritative, cutting through the post-battle haze. "Bring me clean water and linen and build up the fire." The Granite Creek warriors, who moments ago had been taking orders from Kale, now moved to obey her without question. They saw not a consort, but a leader. A queen who bled and fought and now healed her king with her own 2 hands. She knelt beside Rowan, her fingers gently probing the edges of the wound. It was deep, ragged, and bleeding profusely. "Stay with me," she murmured, her voice soft but firm for his eyes alone. "Hurts more than last time," he rasped, a weak ghost of a smile touching his lips. He watched her as she worked, his gaze filled with a raw, unguarded vulnerability she had never seen before. The ice was gone. The walls were gone. The cold king had been burned away in the heat of battle, and all that was left was the man, her mate, placing his life completely and utterly in her hands. As she cleaned the wound and began the painstaking process of stitching it closed with a needle and thread from her pouch, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Aria." She didn't look up from her work, her focus absolute. "For what?" "For the cold," he breathed, the words heavy with years of regret. "For pushing you away. I thought if I kept everyone out, the pain couldn't get in again. But it was already inside. I was just locking it in with me." "Shh," she whispered, her hands never faltering. She tied off the final stitch, her work neat and precise. "There is nothing to forgive, Rowan. You survived. That's all that matters." She finally met his gaze, her own eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You survived, and you came back to me." The last of his defenses crumbled. In that moment, surrounded by the debris of their battle, she was not just healing a wound in his side, she was mending the shattered pieces of his soul. He reached up, his hand cupping her cheek, his touch so full of tenderness it made her ache. Their bond, which had once been a matter of fate and instinct, was now a conscious choice. It was a promise made not in the light of the moon but in the smoky darkness of a battle-scarred cave, sealed not with a kiss, but with a suture and a shared understanding of pain. He was her king, and she was his queen. But here, in the heart of the mountain, they were simply two halves of a whole, finally truly, finding their way back together. Chapter 24. A Kingdom of Scars. A month later, a fragile peace had settled over the fortress. The black granite walls no longer felt like a prison to Aria. They felt like home. The oppressive fear that had once haunted the corridors under Valerius's influence had been replaced by a current of cautious optimism. The traitorous lord was gone, exiled to the northern wastelands to face a justice of cold and solitude, a fate Rowan had deemed more fitting than a quick death. The Granite Creek clan, true to Aria's promise, were now their staunchest allies, their warriors a common and welcome sight within the keep. A new era was beginning. Aria stood on the high battlements, the same place where she had felt her world end, but now the wind felt different. It was a promise, not a threat. She was no longer a guest or a complication. She was the queen. The title was spoken with respect by nobles and servants alike, not because of the man she stood beside, but because of the woman she had proven herself to be. Rowan came to stand beside her, his arm, now free of its sling, sliding around her waist. A faint scar remained on his side, a pale line against his skin, a mirror to the many others he carried. He was still the powerful Alpha King, but the chilling emptiness in his eyes was gone forever, replaced by a warm, steady light that was reserved only for her. They stood together, looking out at the vast expanse of their kingdom, a true partnership. "The southern lords have sworn their fealty," he said, his voice a quiet rumble against her ear. "Unconditionally. Your strategy of offering a shield instead of just a sword, it is working." "Our strategy," she corrected softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We do this together." Later that night, in the quiet of their chambers, the weight of the crown was set aside. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. He was tracing the faint, silvery scar that now marked her temple, a souvenir from a rogue's stray blade in the cavern. "A queen's crown," he murmured, his touch impossibly gentle. She smiled, turning in his arms to face him. Her own fingers found their way to the ruined landscape of his back, tracing the old, faded lines with a familiarity that held no pity, only a deep, abiding love. "And a king's history," she whispered. The scars were a part of them now. They were not ugly reminders of pain, but symbols of everything they had survived. They were the testament to their strength, the proof of their resilience. The story of a boy who had walked through hell and a girl who had waited in the ashes, and how they had found each other again in the ruins to build something new. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "I thought I had to be cold to be strong," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I had to rule alone. You taught me that true strength is not the absence of weakness, but the courage to be vulnerable." The core question of their journey, the fear that had haunted them both, was finally answered. Love had not just survived the pain and the betrayal, it had been tempered by it, emerging harder than steel and more precious than any crown. They were not a cold king and a broken girl. They were a bonded, scarred, and unbreakable unit. As he kissed her, a kiss not of desperate passion, but of profound, peaceful certainty, Aria knew they had finally found what they had both been searching for. Not just a kingdom, not just a mate, but a home, built not on stone, but on the unshakable foundation of two souls who had been to the edge of darkness and had chosen to walk back into the light together.